What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a lore video on Mindflayers and the Gith and how they relate to Baldur's Gate 3. Though right here at the beginning I do need to inform you that this video is sponsored by Larian Studios, which I accepted because they specifically asked me to talk about a lore subject, which is the kind of thing that this channel itself actually got started on, really, with Divinity Original Sin 2. That said, Baldur's Gate 3 itself, launched on August 3rd on PC via Steam, is coming to PS5 on September 6th, just the day after this video. And while there is no date for it yet, the Xbox version is coming and being actively worked on. If you want more information than that, there will be a link below where you can learn more about it. And while Larian Studios is known for their other games like Divinity Original Sin 2, Baldur's Gate 3 is set in the Dungeons & Dragons universe, of which the Mindflayers are particularly interesting. So let's actually dive into where the Mindflayers come from, what their goals were, and what ultimately led to the downfall of their empire, at the hands of a race known as the Gith. But let's start with a little bit about Mindflayers themselves. As a race, they are extremely old. They predate recorded history in terms of Dungeons & Dragons, and in fact they are so old that even the Mindflayers themselves don't appear to have much knowledge of their exact origins anymore. So while reports can vary about where they came from, there are a few different theories, but to start, Mindflayers, or Illithids as they are also known, are considered aberrations. An aberration is a creature type that essentially means that it is unnatural. It has no place in the natural order of the world, or even in most planes of existence. So in short, they don't exactly seem to belong here, which can make them seem especially bizarre to the other inhabitants of the world. But when talking about the origins of the Mindflayers, that's an important thing to keep in mind, because there are two theories generally about where they came from. One theory posits that they are simply aliens from an unimaginably distant future that was basically the end of time, and in order to prevent their own extinction from this, they used a powerful spell to send themselves back in time, seemingly just appearing to the known world before subsequently taking over. Another theory still is that Mindflayers are actually the cursed mutant offspring of a race of humans from another universe. This might stem from the fact that Mindflayers are roughly comparable to thin humans in terms of their general anatomy, with the notable exceptions being the tentacles on their face, as part of their somewhat octopus-like head, reminiscent of course of the Cthulhu mythos. Regardless of how Mindflayers appeared, however, they started making use of their very strong psionic abilities to dominate other races, forming a vast empire. Because while these creatures are not particularly physically imposing, they possess a great intellect and psionic ability that allows them to turn other sentient creatures into thralls and effectively slaves, which they then go on to use them for labor, of course, but also food, because Mindflayers use other creatures' brains as sustenance. Things like the mind and intellect in general are at the core of the Illithid race, and at the height of their power, they used all of these abilities to dominate basically everyone else. Their empire was vast and spanned the astral and ethereal planes, and at one point was even so large it threatened to disrupt the outer planes, where things like celestials, devils, and demons live. And with this vast empire came a lot of other things, such as technology that is now mostly lost. We see this in things like the Nautiloid, the flying ship that we can see at the beginning of Baldur's Gate 3, to name a specific example. However, while Mindflayers are possessed of incredible intellect, the ability to dominate others via their psionic abilities, they have a few weaknesses that I would say ultimately led to their downfall. For starters, they rely on other races for basically everything, despite thinking themselves superior. The obvious things being a source of food and labor, but also reproduction, because Mindflayers reproduce through a method called Ceremorphosis, in which suitable candidates, let's say, are infected with Illithid tadpoles before being turned into an Illithid themselves, which kills the host and effectively spawns a brand new Mindflayer. However, even this has some caveats. Exactly what is made from a particular host can vary. For instance, if they want to make specifically a Mindflayer, they need a roughly humanoid race like like a human or an elf or one of the Gith, though in the event of a tadpole being inserted in something like a beholder or a dragon, you can get other more, I would say, interesting variants of what a Mind Flayer might be, such as a Mind Witness or a Brain Stealer dragon. At the height of their empire, however, Mind Flayers primarily enslaved a race known as the Gith, or at least would become known as the Gith following their uprising. Managing to break free of the psionic control employed by the Mind Flayers, the Gith went on to uproot their entire empire in the astral plane in roughly less than a year. Most of this was facilitated by a Gith woman known as Gith. Gith was literally her name, which then went on to serve as the name for the rest of the race. However, after the Illithid Empire in the astral plane was destroyed and Mind Flayers were forced on the run, where many of them sought the relative seclusion of places like the Underdark, because as a race they also prefer dark places as the sun is unpleasant to them, the Gith then found themselves at a bit of a crossroads between two of their leaders, Gith and one of her generals known as Zerthamon. Gith wanted to continue tracking down and hunting to extinction the rest of the Mind Flayers, whereas her counterpart Zerthamon thought they should begin the process of mending their broken civilization from this incredibly traumatic experience. Ultimately, this led to a civil war within the Gith, which led to the factions of the Githyanki and Githzerai, which are essentially at this point sub-races of the Gith that represent different ideologies. The Githyanki are present in Baldur's Gate 3, where you get a very good look at their society. They are a militant race of astral plane dwellers whose main goal is the destruction of Mind Flayers at the cost of basically everything else. So much so that their leader Gith formed a pact with the Queen of Evil Dragons known as Tiamat. While the specifics of this deal are intentionally shrouded in mystery that a game like Baldur's Gate 3 might just explore a little bit of, it ultimately gave the Githyanki a pact of sorts with red dragons. So this is why Githyanki and red dragons are often seen together, despite both of them being races that are not known for getting along with others. While the Githyanki themselves are militaristic and hostile, if anything, the Githzerai would be easy to perhaps consider the more agreeable of the two factions. They are still incredibly distrustful of outsiders, and they also hate Mind Flayers with a passion. Beyond that, the Githzerai are more monastic, and we don't really see them in Baldur's Gate 3, but it's worth knowing a little bit about them and their ways. Following the collapse of their empire, however, the Mind Flayers had merely retreated and were not completely routed. While they are absolutely a shadow of the power of their former empire, they still have a few things worth mentioning about their society and their goals today. Simply put, most of them are in hiding, however. They are not in possession of enough numbers or military might, so to speak, to really conquer much of anything. At the very least, not directly. However, against the backdrop of the fall of their empire, they also made some fundamental changes to their society as a whole. A thing about Mind Flayers is that they tend to serve something called an elder brain. An elder brain is a giant floating brain, typically with some tentacles of some kind around it, and it is, in a way, the final stage of a Mind Flayer life cycle. That is to say, an elder brain is an accumulation of combined Mind Flayer intellect. Most Mind Flayers have a sort of briny pool of cerebral fluid where they grow their tadpoles, and it's where they put the brains of the fallen Illithid when they reach the end of their life. And while the exact nature of it is kept a little bit vague by design, through this process an elder brain can eventually form, where it becomes the center of an Illithid colony these days, or society in general really, and commands everyone else. It is theorized that at one point Mind Flayers had a little bit more of autonomy, but in the wake of their fallen empire, they basically decided to all obey an elder brain without question to enact what they call the Grand Design, which is the collective goal of the Mind Flayers to return to their once vast empire and dominate everything known. And while an elder brain is exceedingly rare after the downfall of their society, it is still a Mindflayer's goal to grow one of these, essentially, where it can help them dominate the planes again. However, this is done through their incredibly powerful psionic ability. Any Elder Brain at all poses a significant threat to anything in its vicinity, as it is in possession of an impossibly large amount of knowledge, which only grows with every subsequent brain that it feeds on. On average, this influence is so great that they can sense any brain within roughly 5 miles, as well as influence it in an attempt to dominate them. However, Elder Brains also served as a library of knowledge, so to speak, for the rest of the Mindflayers in their control, as an Elder Brain represented the accumulated knowledge of everything they had learned. So in the fall of their empire, when vast swaths of their knowledge was lost, this caused Mindflayers to become weaker in more than just numbers alone, as it cost them access to many of the things they knew how to do previously, such as maintaining their nautiloids or their giant tentacle ships. This makes the previous great works of their society a scarce resource these days, which is why nautiloids are often now very rarely used where they were once quite common. Not the least of which because a giant ship capable of flying over cities and abducting citizens into their care to be tadpoled makes for a prime target for hunting parties of the Gith, who still very much so actively seek the destruction of more and more Mindflayers. Though, as a point of curiosity, it's probably worth mentioning that the Mindflayers did not actually invent the nautiloids either. They were created through trade with the Arcane, which is a race of spacefaring merchants, so to speak, often associated with creating spell-jamming vessels or flying ships, to put it simply. But in any event, in the current timeline, Mindflayers have lost the knowledge and secrets that are required to construct more of them, which makes them incredibly careful with the ones they do have. So seeing one crash at the beginning of Baldur's Gate 3 would be a major event for the Illithids who owned it, especially one with a transponder that allows it to travel the planes and not just through regular space, such as we see in the game when we travel through Avernus, the first layer of hell. These days, Mindflayers are hunted and reviled pretty much everywhere they go, and while they use the intellect they have to try to pull the strings behind the scenes to set up nefarious plots to take over and enact their grand design, they are nonetheless a shadow of their former power, hunted to near extinction by races like the Gith that hate them with everything they have, which forces them into the secretive places of environments like the Underdark. Though in order to wrap this video up, I want to leave you guys with a last little bit of knowledge about Mindflayers in particular, which is the concept of rogue Mindflayers and the Adversary. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, these days Mindflayers are essentially themselves thralls to an Elder Brain, and while most seem to be fine with this arrangement, many of them, especially ones that come into contact with magic, are not. You see, Mindflayers possess a great intellect, which might lead you to naturally wonder why they do not pursue magic. This is because it's largely seen as taboo of sorts within their society, as many of them are rather encouraged to purely develop their psionic abilities, despite having a very natural aptitude for magic through their intellect. This is because magic uses the weave, which is not something that can be absorbed by an Elder Brain after the fact. And if there is any being that understands knowledge as power, it is an Elder Brain, which means that Mindflayers that don't conform to the needs of the colony are often killed outright, which can lead to some of them trying to escape. Because Mindflayers that find themselves outside of the range of an Elder Brain can, over time, regain their independence and freedom of thought. Another interesting thing is the prophecy of sorts within Mindflayer society known as the Adversary. The process of transforming others into Mindflayers typically destroys everything that the person who became the Mindflayer was, but this isn't always the case. Sometimes, this process leads to things being carried forward, like subtle little tics, personality traits that the person who became the Mind Flayer used to have. This is very much so frowned upon by Mind Flayers. Anytime this is discovered to have happened, that Mind Flayer will often be killed. This is because Mind Flayers are terrified of what happens if someone undergoes the transformation process but retains their identity and who they were. This is known as the Adversary, and Mind Flayers believe it will lead them to complete extinction. And for all those reasons and more, Mind Flayers remain at the heart of some of people's favorite D&D content, as the creatures themselves tend to make the perfect sort of evil genius behind the scenes, pulling the string for a variety of encounters and campaigns, some of which you can experience for yourself in Baldur's Gate 3, in addition to creating a character that is unique to you, which in combination with the choices you make will determine how the world reacts to you, an adventure consisting of loot, battle, romance across the Forgotten Realms and the planes beyond. And you don't have to do this alone. You can take some friends along for the ride via the online multiplayer. And for those concerned about jumping into the third game, don't worry, you don't need to have played the first two in order to enjoy Baldur's Gate 3, though there are iconic characters, locations, etc. from those previous games in here as well. And if you'd like some more information, I myself have made videos detailing the stories of those first couple of games and what you might like to know. In any event though, don't forget the link down below if you would like to learn more, but that's pretty much going to do it for this video. So I certainly hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned more about the interesting lore behind both Mind Flayers and the Gith as well, but regardless of any of that, truly just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.